What makes a rightful king? And what makes a rightful king of the Seven Kingdoms specifically? The latter question is a much tougher nut to crack, because in our world, most kingdoms have and have had for a long time detailed sets of rules governing succession, which settle at least some possible debates. Concerning Westeros and its Seven Kingdoms, we have no direct access to such rules, but can only look for hints in the text of the novels and other material. Some lessons, however, will have to be learned from the real world anyway, as we will see. Most arguments about who is or was the rightful king of the Andals, the Rhoynar, and the First Men revolve around three concepts: succession through the male line, primogeniture, and right of conquest. One of those is not like the others, however, as it has played virtually no role at all in how people thought about legitimacy during our Middle Ages, while it plays at least some role in how people think about legitimacy in Westeros. I am talking about the right of conquest here. The phrase itself never occurs in the text, despite readers ascribing both Aegon the Conqueror's and Robert Baratheon's legitimacy as kings, as well as the legitimacy of their dynasties, to the right of conquest. What does the text actually say about this then? Let's look at Aegon the Conqueror first. Why is he king in the eyes of his contemporaries and in the eyes of history? Because of the mere fact that he was able to seize Westeros? Not quite, actually. You see, while power might to some extent be power, as Cersei tells us in the show, power is not legitimacy. Otherwise, we could drop the notion of legitimacy altogether and simply use the term power. Being in power and being a rightful king or queen is certainly not the same. Think of the stewards of Gondor from The Lord of the Rings, for example. Their rule over Gondor was never in dispute once there was no king of Gondor around anymore. But there is no way they simply could have become kings themselves either. We could argue that they never conquered Gondor and therefore can't be kings according to this mysterious right of conquest, but that Gondor was simply left behind for them. I'd rather say that, while not completely wrong, such an account of the situation is misleading and missing the actual point. Let's take another example, an historical one this time. How did kingship develop among the Germanic tribes? It developed during the migration period, when Herzöge, as we say in German, which comes closest to what the word would have sounded like back in the day, or duces in Latin, or dukes, which all mean leaders of troops, were turned from rather temporary offices, leading warriors or a complete tribe on a more or less military campaign, into rather permanent offices, something like elected petty kings. Many of these dukes indeed became kings later on, and at some point started passing on their offices to their heirs. These kingdoms were not so very unlike democracies in this regard. A king had to rely on the support of the tribe, which means, of course, the people and also the nobility, which came into existence alongside their kings. The lesson we can take away from this is that a king's legitimacy has always rested on approval by the nobility and the people. Somewhat later, those Germanic kings, much as any king ever, came up with additional sources of legitimacy to bolster their claims. Because once you're a king, you don't really want to depend on the whims of the people who made you king, right? The usual way here was to claim descendants from a set of heroic and or mythic ancestors. The Merovingians, for example, claimed descendants from a sea monster, but subsequently found that less and less befitting the kings of the Franks and claimed descendants from the kings of Troy instead. Conquest, which the Merovingians could easily have boasted without exaggerating at all, since Clovis had indeed conquered a vast amount of territory and carved out the biggest of the new Germanic kingdoms on European soil for his Franks, did not seem like the way to go. Clovis himself did something else instead, additional to their claim of mythic descendants. He got baptized. In contrast to the Goths, however, he was baptized by the Roman Catholic Church, and was therefore able to claim God's mandate, not an entirely new concept, but a very important one, and one of the decisive factors for the Frankish dominance among the Germanic tribes, as well as the dominance of the Roman Catholic Church over all others. Variants of this concept can be found all over the world, sometimes combined with the mythic descendants. In the same vein as Clovis claimed to be chosen by God, the Egyptian pharaoh was considered the son of Ra. The Sapa Inca was considered the son of Inti, and the emperor of China possessed the mandate of heaven. We can see clearly now that power and conquest, for that matter, don't equal legitimacy and vice versa. It is very possible to rule a country like a king without being the legitimate king, or even any kind of king at all. And it is equally possible to be a king, even a legitimate and accepted one, without wielding any power. A good example can be found by looking at the Merovingians again. Long after Clovis, the Merovingians were still kings of the Franks, but the real power was in the hands of their eventual successors, the Carolingians, who were something like their stewards at the time, but did not dare to take the crown for themselves just yet. It would take the advent of the Moors, a formidable outside threat against which the Carolingians proved their worth, to change that. That said, power is obviously not without its uses in deciding who is a rightful king and who is not. If rightful kingship comes down to the support of one's claim by the nobility and the people, and if this support comes down to people's beliefs, power becomes part of this equation as a force which can shape such beliefs. A king who loses battle after battle, for example, might have a somewhat harder time convincing people that God meant for him to be king. We should think of other aspects of our question in the same vein. Let's take Aerys II for another example. Was he the rightful king? Was he still the rightful king when Jaime did him in? I see two main arguments against his legitimacy. The first one is duty. A feudal society is all about individuals. The German term Personenverbundsstaat in opposition to territorial state captures this aspect better than any English term. The whole state hinges on relations between individuals spread throughout the land and the society. These relations are vertical or hierarchical, but they are not unidirectional. The lords of the land have duties towards the king, but the king also has duties towards them. The same applies for a great lord and his smaller lords, and even the peasants. A king's duty is, for one thing, to treat and judge his lieges fairly and not use his greater power to do them harm. We can clearly see how Aerys II failed to live up to this when he tortured Rickard Stark to death, even if he might have been justified in executing Rickard's son Brandon. We can now say, of course, that it was not simply the case that Aerys failed to honor his duty, but that people were convinced he failed to do so. Other kings and lords also didn't do their duty at some points, but they arguably never stopped being rightful kings or lords respectively. What actually ended Aerys II's kingship, rightful or otherwise, was the resistance of his lords. The resistance rested on more pillars than his failure to do his duty alone. He was also considered mad, which would make him unfit not only to rule, but also for kingship, which is not the same thing as we have seen. As we have said, a feudal society is based on the relationships between individuals. And that, of course, means on trust. A madman, however, cannot be trusted, even if he seems to do his duty, or someone does it for him. Probably even more importantly, by the time of Aerys II, House Targaryen had long lost the most important foundation of their kingship, their dragons. Aegon won his kingdom from the back of his dragon. The Targaryens' control of the beasts seemed to prove them more than human. What did Aerys have to show for his already diluted dragon blood, though? Dragons were a distant memory, and in the veins of other nobles all over Westeros ran nearly as much dragon blood as in his own. Losing those dragons must have been like Rudolf of Rheinfelden losing the Holy Lands, just several times over. The mythical aspect to House Targaryen had been greatly diminished. Aegon V had already seen that earlier. The former kings of the lands of Westeros had bent the knee and sworn fealty to a man who controlled a huge dragon as proof not only of his power, but of his specialness. Aerys himself lacked either of those. Therefore, When Robert took the Iron Throne from him, he didn't simply take it as a conqueror. He took it as the leader of a coalition of lieges who had lost faith in a liege lord who had been neglecting his duty towards them and had turned mad and had thereby proven to be unfit to be a king. Last but not least, it fell to Robert to lead the rebels because he was most closely related to House Targaryen and came from the line of a Targaryen bastard, Orys Baratheon. Robert and the other lords opted to make use of their right of resistance, as we know it from Machiavelli's Discorsi. We should not confuse a dynasty's fiction of why they are kings with the underlying reality of it. Surely we don't believe it to be God's counsel that incest-ridden, drooling, incontinent spawns of House Habsburg ruled the Holy Roman Empire for so long, and several other nations. So why should we pretend to? They weren't kings and queens and emperors and empresses because God had sent them, but because they had managed to make people believe that their Habsburg blood set them apart. In other words, what made them kings and queens was the fealty of their lieges and by extension the people. And what made them, in most cases anyway, rightful kings and queens and emperors and empresses is that their reign was in accordance with people's ideas of who should be king or queen, or emperor or empress. For example, many lords swore fealty to Roose Bolton, but arguably very few of them believe that he is entitled to the north. Littlefinger probably wants to be king, but I highly doubt he really thinks he should be. By should, I mean here that people hold certain normative beliefs as to what makes a king or lord, and that a rightful king or lord fits this description. Let's see if we can apply this to the situation at the end of A Dance with Dragons. There are 5 kings or queens presumably still alive and kicking. Tommen, Stannis, Dany, Aegon and Euron. And there's a couple of noteworthy potential pretenders. Jon Snow, Gendry and Theon most importantly. Who is the rightful king or queen? We can rule out Gendry and Tommen pretty quickly. Tommen is clearly a king right now and he has some support. But does he fit the description of what Westerosi society thinks makes a rightful king? No. As an abomination born of incest, he clearly isn't. Gendry holds no power and is a bastard, who therefore can't be Robert's heir while Stannis is alive. There might be an argument to be made for him over Shireen though, but for the moment that doesn't mean anything. Aegon's legitimacy rests completely on his true identity. If he is indeed Aegon VI, son of Rhaegar Targaryen, he is the heir to the Targaryen line. The only chance Dany has of disputing this is if Aerys indeed made Viserys his heir instead of Rhaegar, and if we believe that a sister comes before a nephew in the eyes of Westerosi society. However, Aerys was clearly mad when he disinherited Rhaegar, so this must be considered null and void. Jon Snow has no claim if he is indeed Rhaegar's bastard. If Rhaegar married Lyanna, things might be a little different. But since we have seen no indication of that, let's move on. This leaves us with Euron and Theon. Having won the Kingsmoot that everyone had agreed upon, Euron has at least become the legitimate leader of the Ironborn. The whole problem here is, though, that it is not abundantly clear what the Ironborn consider legitimate. Can some highly abominable deed make him unworthy in the eyes of the Ironborn? How important is it really that no godless man may sit the Seastone chair? One thing is very clear, however. Euron is no king of Westeros, legitimate or otherwise for now. Our verdict, therefore, should be: to our knowledge, at the end of A Dance with Dragons, or after the preview chapters from The Winds of Winter respectively, Euron is the rightful leader of the Ironborn, and Theon can only challenge him if he can make the captains hold another Kingsmoot. Theon's claim is rather weak, but we cannot throw it out completely, because we know too little about Ironborn customs. Theon would normally have been Balon's heir, but 2 facts compromise his position legally. Balon named Asha his heir, and the Kingsmoot crowned Euron. Before or at the Kingsmoot, he might have prevailed. Since support for Asha, the one person with a better claim before the Kingsmoot, seemed feeble. Now, after the King's Moot, he can really only become king if people were to throw out the whole thing because it was held in Theon's absence. That said, we don't know if the Ironborn would consider such an argument convincing, let alone follow a cripple and a eunuch. Kings losing their claim due to mutilation is a common enough thing, with the Byzantine Empire providing many examples. With Stannis as the legitimate heir of his house, Euron as the legitimate leader of his people, and Dany most likely the legitimate heir to Aerys' line, we haven't determined who should rule Westeros though. It is clear that Euron has no claim to the Iron Throne. But was he within his rights to proclaim himself king and rule the Isles? We have to say yes, I think. The ultimate argument in his favor is that Balon had every right to declare independence with a king on the throne who had no legitimacy at all, Joffrey. The kingdom had been in complete disarray already anyway. The Ironborn had every right to take their future into their own hands. This leaves us with the question if Dany or Stannis should sit the Iron Throne. In other words, does Westeros belong to House Targaryen or House Baratheon? This is a very tough question. On the one hand, Robert had claimed the throne as the Great Lord most closely related to House Targaryen, like the Hohenstaufen did with the Salian dynasty, for example. This implies that the Targaryen heritage is still a decisive factor. On the other hand, he was justified in deposing the Mad King, and he himself was, in terms of legitimacy that is, as good a choice as any to succeed Aerys, provided the lords didn't trust Viserys or Dany to turn into a good king or queen, despite the demise of their father. For that would have been the obvious choice in terms of legitimacy, to crown Viserys and rule in his stead until he came of age. This would have been easier said than done, of course. With Dany and Stannis, George has left us with an almost unsolvable puzzle, and most likely intentionally so, as he hinted at himself. We will try to solve it anyway. Stannis has going for him that he is clearly Robert's heir, so all doubts about him on the throne can only hinge on Robert not being fully legitimate in the first place, barring Stannis being unfit or neglecting his duties. His duty he certainly did when he suddenly turned up at the Wall with his army. And at least in the books, I don't think we have a case against him being fit to rule. Dany has going for her that Aerys' madness and neglect of his duties can hardly be held against her personally. Robert, Jon Arryn and Ned should have crowned Rhaegar and detained Aerys while that was still possible, but they didn't. It remains to be seen, however, if that was due to Robert's jealousy or rather Rhaegar's stubbornness in supporting his father. The lack of information on how it was decided that Robert should be king, and if bringing Rhaegar into the fold would have been a possibility, is the root of the whole problem in my opinion, and our beloved author might very well keep this question up in the air indefinitely, or at least for quite a while longer. If I were a gambler though, my money would be on Robert intentionally seeking to keep Rhaegar out of their plans for a post-Aerys Westeros, and therefore being in the wrong, which makes Dany the legitimate queen of Westeros, barring her turning mad or neglecting her duty like her father did, of course. We might add to this that as the mother of dragons, she could easily regain a lot of what has been lost since the Dance of the Dragons in terms of the special status of House Targaryen and their bloodline. A little side note on Aegon. Aegon VI might be part of this discussion yet, as he will probably turn out to be the head of House Blackfyre. If he is, and if we believe that Daemon Blackfyre should have been king, Aegon would be the rightful king of the Seven Kingdoms. More precisely put, he would have to meet the conditions of what makes a rightful king in the eyes of Westerosi society. That means that he would have to be considered the true and rightful king in the eyes of Westerosi society, with them having all the information needed on the Blackfyre Rebellion. Since we have no clear reason to assume that Daemon Blackfyre indeed fought the good fight and should have been king in the eyes of the greats and the people, Aegon is rather the dark horse here. George could easily turn this situation around completely, however, were he to give us a more detailed account of why Daemon Blackfyre chose rebellion. Finally, we should talk about the question if Dany, assuming that she is the rightful queen and not Stannis the rightful king, would be within her rights to demand fealty from Euron, who we said is the rightful king of the Iron Islands. This question might also apply to a possible new king in the north, by the way. But let's stick with Euron for the sake of simplicity. In other words, does succession from Joffrey's kingdom mean that Dany can't demand them to be part of the Seven Kingdoms once again? This is one tough question. On the one hand, it is hardly Dany's fault that her predecessors, if she is actually to become Queen of Westeros, were mad, neglected their duty, or were Lannisters posing as Baratheons. On the other hand, it is hardly Euron's fault, or Balon's for that matter, that Robert allowed a situation to arise in which a little shit with no actual claim whatsoever could end up sitting the Iron Throne. Anyway, as I see it, few of the lords and captains of the Iron Islands will ever have sworn fealty to a Targaryen king, much less a sane one in their lifetime. There's little to bind them to Dany. If the lords and captains stick with Euron over Dany once she reaches Westeros and doesn't join forces with Euron, their choice is legitimate. To sum this up, there are a couple of different things we have to keep separate in these matters. Power isn't kingship. Kingship isn't legitimacy, and legitimacy isn't power. Moreover, who the legitimate king or queen is usually comes down to at least two separate questions. Which dynasty has a right to the throne, and who is the first in line among its members? Sometimes there are kingsmoods or great councils interfering with the rules of succession within a certain house or even across different houses, but usually, as we have seen, the toughest questions concern the legitimacy of entire lines. Answers to such questions can only be found by looking at the historical junctures that created disputes over which line or house should inherit, and can quite often simply be traced back to unresolved disputes over succession within a line, as in the case of the Blackfyre Pretenders. House Blackfyre only ever became a house of its own when Daemon Blackfyre got the sword but not the throne. Therefore, if we believe that Daemon should have been king, and that his descendants have done nothing to forfeit this heritage, any debate over Dany or Stannis becomes obsolete. In other words, if legitimacy has lain with House Blackfyre all those years, no shift in power can change that. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to subscribe, like, share, comment, and visit the shit out of our blog.